North America. By the middle of the 10th century, caravans of white settlers had traveled across the Great Plains to the far west. These are now the modern states of Nevada, California, and Oregon. As a rule, the pioneers were very afraid of encounters with redskins. Not all tribes that met on their way were hostile, but sometimes individual settlers themselves provoked Indians to cruel actions. After the discovery of the American continents and the exploration of new lands, which was often accompanied by enslavement and extermination of the indigenous population, Europeans were amazed by the methods of struggle of the redskins. The Indian tribes tried to intimidate the foreigners, and therefore the most brutal methods of massacring people were used. Here we can remember the habit of scalping the defeated enemy. But Indians did not do it to mock their victims. They just had an ancient tradition. After the return of the warriors with victory in the settlement ceremonies known as the scalp dance were held, and scalps and other parts of the defeated were an obligatory attribute of these ceremonies. The Indians of North America and Canada scalped their enemies by cutting the skin off the top of their skulls so that the great Manitou could not grab them by the hair and drag them to redskin paradise. Sometimes the Indians scalped their captives, after which they freed them and let them go home to serve as a reminder to their enemies. Thus, in 1830, Blackfeet warriors captured a woman of this tribe near the Flathead camp, raped her, scalped her alive, and then released her. The stories include tales of the cruel tortures the Indians practiced on their captives. The simplest was when they were scalped alive. The Comanche Indians were sophisticated. They tied the captive to stakes on the plains, cut off his eyelids from his eyes, and left him under the scorching sun. They usually killed male captives. Two tribes, the Iroquois and the Choctaw, were particularly cruel in torture. The former liked to tear out the eyeballs of their victims and almost immediately burn the eye sockets with red-hot coals. The Iroquois were not disdainful of inflicting various mutilations in the form of gradual cutting off a piece of flesh from the captives and burning them at the stake, as well as roasting them on fire. The Choctaw did to the victim what the English did to captured bears many years later: chase it round a pole with burning torches until the man fell dead from pain, horror, and fatigue. The French, who were honored guests of the Montagnais Indians, helped them through their firearms to defeat the Iroquois, and then were horrified to see what the Montagnais did to the captives. The Iroquois were tortured for several days. They were burned with burning branches, whipped with whips, and had their skin pierced with an awl. They were tied to poles, had their fingers and ears cut off, and were forced to eat. Their sinews were torn out, and their scalps were lifted, and hot sand was thrown on their skull bones. The captives died slowly, and yet showed incredible courage. To the amazement of the French, some of them never once cried out in pain, but only sang without ceasing until they died. In 1755, the British Army was defeated by the French and their Ottawa allies in the forests of Pennsylvania. Some of the survivors were captured, sent back to the banks of the Agay River, and after their faces were blackened with soot, subjected to a slow roasting. The air was filled with the sounds of the triumphant howls of the Indians. Usually, the Indian execution, reminiscent of Russian military punishment through the ranks, ended sadly for the captives. But there were exceptions. Many years before John Stark, an American military officer and participant in the French and Indian War, became a hero of the American Revolution. He was captured by Indians. They picked up sticks and led him through the ranks. Stark managed to grab a club from the first man in the line and used it to fight off the others. The warriors and the chief were so surprised by this that they stopped the execution and accepted him into their tribe. John was later ransomed for $163 and returned home. The Indians did not regard nobility and leniency as virtues, but on the contrary as an unnecessary risk, so they treated their captives extremely cruelly, scalping them or burning them alive, tying them to a pole. When the Dakota Indians took prisoners, they tied them to a post and dismembered them, said American Colonel Forsyth. First, He did not go into the cellar woods, but led an expedition against Indian villages on the Sandusky River. Defeated by the Indians, Crawford was unable to organize a retreat and himself surrendered to just 3 Indians who attacked his group on the retreat. But the torture he endured with extraordinary courage. On the 11th of June, 1782, Crawford was stripped naked and beaten to begin with. The Indians began firing blanks at William with flintlock rifles. His body was blackened with gunpowder, and his face was a ghastly mask of blood and soot. At very close shots, the grains of gunpowder and saltpeter burned on his skin, burning through it and continuing to burn under the skin, causing incredible suffering. The colonel bravely kept it off. Soon, one of the Indians cut off the unfortunate man's ears, and 4 others began to stick smoldering hickory nut rods into the colonel's naked body. The men were joined by the women, who began to throw burning coals at him. When the exhausted Crawford fell face down, the Indians doused his head. The colonel died. The deaths of Catholic missionaries at the hands of North Americans were quite brutal. Only in 1642 to 1649, Iroquois brutally tortured 8 Catholic priests and monks of the Jesuit order. Antoine Daniel, Gabriel Lallemand, Isaac Jogues, Jean de Brébeuf, Jean de Lalagne, Charles Garnier, Noël Chabanel, and René Goupil. The Holy Fathers traveled to Indian settled territories to nurture European Catholics and baptize the natives. It quickly became clear to the locals that baptism was often followed by enslavement and occupation of their territories, and they dealt harshly with both the pioneers and their witch doctors. Since the Iroquois were not interested in simply killing, they brutally tortured their captives. Before being executed, the Jesuits underwent truly martyrdom, and their canonization in 1930 by Pope Pius XI had every reason to do so. Here, for example, is how the torture of the Holy Father, Jean de Brébeuf, is described by a surviving eyewitness. The Iroquois first cut off his hands and pierced his body with sharp iron in many places. Then they hung red-hot tomahawks around his neck, so that the unfortunate man could not even turn his head to avoid injury. Around his waist, the men wrapped bark dipped in tar and varnish, which was then set on fire. Seeing with what fortitude the prisoner endeavored to endure the torture, praying incessantly, the Iroquois grabbed burning twigs from the fire and put them in his mouth. When that failed, they cut off the missionary's lips and tongue to silence him. The natives doused the Holy Father with boiling water. His flesh was roasted and eaten. Finally, before a merciful death took de Brébeuf, his feet were chopped off and he was scalped. Another example of elaborate cruelty was given by the Tawakoni Indians, who captured about 10 warriors of the Tanka tribe. They slowly and gradually skinned their victims, first from the arms and legs, and then from the torso. All the while, the wounds were cauterized with burning coals. The Indians were notorious for their cruel treatment of their captives. One Euro-American wrote of them, "The atrocities to which they subject their captives are so great that even to tell of them would cause horror and make the narrator complicit in them." Francisco Ruiz, the mayor of San Antonio, Texas, told the story of a prisoner captured by the Indians. Knowing that death awaited him, he accepted it with cold-blooded indifference and belted out a death song. Then he began to insult his executioners, not forgetting a single foul epithet against them. The women, eagerly awaiting their opportunity to mock the victim, built a huge fire at the foot of the pillar. The captive's arms were twisted out of their joints and tied to the pole with a rope round his neck. Another rope was tied round his legs. The dancing warriors grabbed the rope around his legs and pulled so that his body was on fire. At the same moment, others would grab the rope around his neck and loosen it. This went on for 5 days and could have gone on longer, as the Tawakoni took special care not to prematurely damage vital organs. In spite of the unbearable pain, the captive sang his death song and endured the agony with the greatest courage until he died. Pocahontas was the daughter of a powerful Powhatan chief. Pocahontas means pamper girl, probably the name her parents affectionately called her. She was 11 years old when the English landed on Indian land in May 1607. Her brother took the pale Captain John Smith prisoner. Chief Powhatan ordered 2 large stones to be brought and placed on the ground. Upon these stones, the head of the Englishman was placed. When the guns were about to be brought over him, Pocahontas rushed forward and covered his head with her own. The Indians tortured not only their enemies, but actually themselves. The relatives of the deceased of the Cherokee tribe cut pieces of meat from their own bodies with flint knives. The Shoshone of the Rocky Mountains forced widows to mutilate their faces every time they passed their spouse's grave as a sign of mourning. The sun dance of the North American Indians became famous. During the ritual, a person was fastened with bone hooks on straps to the tree of life, and then he had to pull them out during the dance. From pain and blood loss, the participants began to see the other world and communicate with its inhabitants. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and see you again.